Hi, this is Doug Spencer, and this talk is called Tafuri and the Heavenly Glory of Categorical Critique. I take the term categorical critique from a famous and often cited passage from Manfredo Tafuri's Theories and History of Architecture, 1968, where he writes, "Just as it's not possible to found a political economy based on class, so one cannot anticipate a class architecture, an architecture for a liberated society. What is possible is the introduction of a class criticism into architecture." I take this to point, at least, to the possibility of a categorical critique of architecture rather than a criticism of architecture that suggests it can reform itself so as to act as a force for good or justice or some kind of progressive social reform. And this is in the same sense that Marx can be said to have produced a categorical critique of wage labour. While there may be some immediate value in labour reform, such as the shortening of the working day, without the abolition of wage labour, without the class of workers abolishing its own existence, capitalism itself cannot be overturned, and with it all the forms of exploitation, of injustice and human and environmental injustice cannot be addressed. I don't think that this possibility of a categorical critique that's presented to us by Tafuri has been followed up on. I think that what has happened instead is that people have written a great deal about Tafuri himself. There's been a great deal of writing interpreting Tafuri, and people arguing about whether he meant this or that, but really almost no effort to actually follow through on the possibility of a class criticism of architecture that he pointed the way to. And in that sense, I think Tafuri and that passage, that very well cited passage about the possibility of a class criticism or class critique of architecture, is very much a kind of analogy of an old Zen teaching about a finger pointing at the moon. In the 1973 kung fu film Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee's character encounters a young kung fu student, and after getting this student to demonstrate some of his moves, Bruce Lee's character then proceeds to tell him about this story about a finger pointing at the moon. And the student immediately directs his attention to Bruce Lee's finger. And Bruce Lee gives him a whack round the head and says to him something like, "Don't look at the finger. If you look at the finger, you miss out on the moon that it's pointing at, and you miss out on all that heavenly glory." And so I'm trying to underline the point that we're missing the real substance of the promise of Tafuri, which is the promise of the potential of a class critique of architecture, in part because in the realm of the kind of niche of Tafuri scholarship, the focus is on the finger, not the moon. Tafuri wrote a lot about the idea of exasperation, of things being kind of tortured and reshaped again to the point of exhaustion. And he was opposed in particular to the second wave avant-garde of the late 60s and the 1970s, in which we can see a real kind of efflorescence of formal experimentation coming from various architects and architectural groupings, which in turn present themselves as, you know, perhaps progressive or radical, or presenting kind of hopes in design, or that design and architecture can produce some new world that will deal with the problems that capitalist society is presenting us with. And Tafuri's argument is, well, you can keep exasperating form, you can keep coming up with new shapes. Capitalist development isn't interested in any of this unless it can make a profit out of it. And it's capitalist development that leads society, not architecture. Architecture will never lead the development of society. So you're just kind of deluding yourselves if you think that architecture is the way to address any of the crises then, and I think the argument still goes very much today. However, by the 1990s, we see what we might even describe as a kind of third wave of supposedly avant-garde formal experimentation coming from a number of architects. I guess most famously people like Zaha Hadid or Greg Lynn, who are warping, twisting, distorting, folding architecture, making architecture blobby. And this actually does get built, and capitalist development is interested in it, precisely because it's shifted from a more or less welfare state model to a more or less market-based and neoliberal model of how capitalism produces and reproduces value. And architecture has a place in that. It has a place in kind of marketing places, marketing places. It has a role in serving as propaganda, like built propaganda for new developments. But I've written about this at great length already in The Architecture of Neoliberalism, so I'm not going to say a great deal more about it. Likewise, concurrent with this development of what I've described broadly as the architecture of neoliberalism, there is what I might equally well describe as the theory of the architecture of neoliberalism as a kind of affirmation of this architecture. So we have, firstly, certain architects and critics like Mark Wigley and Eisenman kind of attaching themselves to and identifying themselves with the deconstructive philosophy of Derrida. Then we go from Derrida to Deleuze, and we have Greg Lynn and Foreign Office architects and Reiser and Yamamoto, and that brings us up to the present day, where the shift is further on, now going from Deleuze to Graham Harman and the idea of an object-oriented ontology. Now, if those kind of forms of theorizing are problematic and take us completely in the opposite direction from a class critique of architecture, then I think it's also worth pointing out that some of the preceding models of architectural theory are equally problematic. So if we take the case of Jameson's writing about architecture, I think this often kind of appears to us as like the good old critical architectural theory. But I have some issues and concerns about its limitations for the purposes of producing an effectively class critical account of architecture. So that is an account of the way in which architecture reproduces and even exacerbates the crises, the injustices of capitalism. So in Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, published I think in 1984, Jameson proposes this model of theory which consists in reading cultural products, including painting and including architecture as well, as the kind of surface cultural signs and symptoms that allow us to read an otherwise obscure base of capital production, that allow us to see how capitalist development is perhaps developing, is going through different stages. So yeah, it's rather like the way in which like a doctor, rather than doing a kind of x-ray to find out what is going on inside the patient, just tries to read the surface, the marks on the skin, the colouring of the eyes, or any kind of surface, without really addressing the depth of the kind of organic nature of the problems. But anyway, so he uses two examples of visual images of visual artworks. The one on the left being from the 1880s, a painting called Peasant Shoes by Vincent van Gogh, and the one on the right being a mid-century screen print, a silk screen print by the pop artist Andy Warhol. And he makes the argument that the boots, the painting of the boots, represent a world which still has a materiality, a tangible materiality about it, and that the thickness of the paint, the impasto, speak of the material realness of that world to which they refer, whereas Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes, in its flatness, speaks to us only of a world which is of images, so we're at one or two or several removes from reality. It's a bit of a strange argument, because if you've seen an Andy Warhol silk screen, you'll know that it too has a very material presence, that you can literally see the register of the thick silk screen ink being squeegeed through the screen. But nevertheless, for Jameson, the shoes of Van Gogh stand for, broadly speaking, this world of modernity with its kind of certainties of reference, that, a thing stands, even if it's an image, stands for a material thing in the real world, whereas in postmodernity the images just kind of refer, kind of sideways to other images. So Jameson is working here through a then current model of semiology and structuralism, where there's this differentiation between the signifier. So he takes the visual artwork as the signifier, as the thing doing the kind of image work, whereas the concept or idea that's signified is not available to us, right? So if we're trying to look at things like historical stages of capitalist development, his argument would be that we can never see these directly. We can't cast our eyes over these developments themselves. We can only trace them as symptoms. And what we're looking at along the horizontal axis is the stages of capitalist development. But we're also looking, in some way, I'd say, try and map one thing onto another, at a very traditional but highly problematic model of understanding culture within Marxism, which is that of base and superstructure, where the signs that are produced in the realm of culture are kind of affirmations or ideological advertisements for the conditions of production produced by capitalism. So Jameson is fixed on what is apparent in order to understand what he argues is obscure. What I take issue with here is that actually the workings of capitalism, its economic workings, the workings of labour, the workings of the circulation of value and the accumulation of value are not obscure. They're not so difficult to look at. And I'm not the first person to make this point by any means. So Mike Davis, in particular, wrote critically of Jameson's account of the Westin Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which is what you're seeing an image of here, an image incidentally taken from the Schwarzenegger film True Lies. But Mike Davis argues, well, you know, there are all these political and economic and racial issues that you have to take into account if you're looking at the built environment of Los Angeles. And to just have a philosopher walking around, registering some impressions of the building and then producing some kind of performative interpretation of what it might really mean is in itself a problematic way of understanding architecture. And for me, I would also add that actually this way of theorizing just comes to be a kind of mirror of the fetishization, which is at the basis of how capitalism ideologically sustains itself anyway, in that it's always getting us to look at the surface effects. It's always getting us to kind of look at commodities. And even if we're looking at them critically, if we're ignoring and obscuring the conditions of production from which they emanate, we are kind of fetishizing those products. So it might be a kind of critical or left fetishization, but it's a fetishization nonetheless, I would argue, in that it's making labour obscure and just looking at the commodity. So it means it effectively confines theory to the realm of appearances and places things like labour and the accumulation of value from labour out of sight. What Jameson produces, as is well known, is a theory of postmodernity, and he does it by an incredibly dense, rich brew of different theorists and critics and cultural references and historical references. And I would argue that what happens in the process is that we don't just get a theory of postmodernity, but we get a postmodernity of theory, where theory itself just becomes about language and references to other references and signs of signs. And this brings me back to another aspect of Tafuri's writing, specifically his essay on architecture in the boudoir, which is in part making the argument that if we fully embrace theories of language and signs, if we fully embrace semiotics and structuralism as the way to understand the world, then we will always end up in the boudoir just talking about references to other references, signs of signs, and in this kind of hall of mirrors. So the question then would be, okay, so how do we break out of the boudoir? how we break out of it to produce a more effective class critique of architecture, which is not just looking at the products as if they appear out of nowhere, but is actually looking much more broadly at the conditions they're produced for and the conditions in turn that they produce. I don't think this can come from theory in itself. I don't think theory can, or criticism can pull itself up by its own bootstraps and just affect a new model of theory. I think there is, and there are, very encouraging signs of an emergence of a class criticism of architecture, but they have come about not through people trying to devise better or improved theories, but they've come about in response to the real circumstances in which architecture is taught and practiced. What you're seeing on the screen at the moment is an image, a screenshot from an event that took place a year ago. So in, I think it was late March or early April of 2022 at SciArc, where an event was live screened in which various luminaries talked about how architectural students and young architectural workers should be ready and willing to bend themselves to the shape of the demands of architectural labour as it currently exists. So to do things like to work 60 hours, not 40 hours. And so this very rightly and understandably produced an enormous kickback, especially from architectural students and architectural workers, because it's just like furthering this line that, well, if you want to fit in, if you want to make progress, you have to exploit yourself as a labourer or exploit yourself as a student. Very much out of touch with a huge, already ongoing current of discourse about labour and exploitation in architecture, it has to be said. So I think it's in response to events like these being outed that we see a kind of an interest in class criticism of architecture, and they really argue for the necessity of this. So if we just return to this model that we were looking at a few minutes ago about commodity being the product, and that is where attention is focused and labour is not focused, then we need to address this so that we can see labour, and the way to do that is to understand the way in which the commodity produces labour and labour produces the commodity. So, you know, the commodity is not a sign of labour. The commodity is produced by labour, and labour is produced by the commodity. So they mutually presuppose each other. Marx says in the Grundrisse that capitalism not only produces a subject for the object, but also an object for the subject, by which he means capitalism doesn't just produce commodities. You have to understand that capitalism also produces wage labour under particular historical circumstances in order to produce the commodity. And in a way we could elaborate on that and say, well, the commodity also produces the consumer of the commodity in a way which sustains the production of the commodity. So there's always these kind of reciprocal, mutually presupposing relations between, let's say, architecture and the design of architecture. So the subject, you know, we don't want to focus, if we want to do a class critique of architecture, on the object. You know, this is why object-oriented ontology will miss entirely how it is that subjects are produced to produce objects, by kind of having a flat ontology where everything is an object. So we have to understand how subjects are produced to produce objects. So that's how to be in an office. So here's my attempt, a preliminary attempt, a work in progress of trying to map out some of these relationships as they pertain to architecture specifically. And it starts with the workplace, the architectural studio, where the architectural worker's labour is being sold as a commodity in order to produce often, maybe not exclusively, but often luxury products such as a pencil tower in Manhattan. So one commodity, labour, the sale of that affects the production, obviously via construction, of another commodity, which is architecture. And architecture is not unique, but we have to notice what's distinct in it. So this is distinct from, like, say, someone who works in a factory making hamburgers, and you can probably, if you work in that factory, you're probably earning enough to buy hamburgers. It's like the classic Fordist model, really, is that those kind of industries sustain themselves by also producing things which are affordable enough to exist on a mass market. So Ford paying his workers enough in the 1920s to be able to afford to buy the type of cars that they were producing between them on the production line. That's not the case in 99% of architectural labour, which is about producing things that you cannot afford to buy yourself. So you're producing a luxury product. Instead, you're much more likely, especially if you're an architectural worker in New York or London, say, to be renting an apartment, quite often a shared apartment. So you are enabling the rent commodity through using the wages which you get paid to produce luxury architecture to live in a shared apartment, not just in your 20s, but often into one's 30s and even 40s. And you will likely have a significant financial debt that you've accrued in the process of qualifying yourself to practice architectural labour. So effectively then we have a circuit of value, what Marx would call value in motion, that is going from the site of labour into luxury production, and then some of that value going back to the worker, which then goes into rent, which then in turn allows the architectural labourer to reproduce their own conditions. And there are class relations evidently at work here. Yeah, if we just look at where an architect, where most architects, not the big guys that we all hear about, where most architects live versus the type of projects that they're designing. So there's a reproduction of existing class relations. There is, further than that, a kind of exacerbation, a kind of rather vicious feedback loop, in that the more architecture increases the real estate value, and effectively the cost of living in the city, the worse quality the accommodation that the architect themselves can afford to live in, or the higher the rents they pay, or the further out they have to live and the more time they have to spend commuting from their accommodation to their workplace. So in a very particular way, architects actually are caught in a trap of alienation, where the products of their own labour actually come to work against them. They work against their own interests. So this is a Marxian sense of alienation rather than any kind of psychological or phenomenological sense of alienation. It's where, like, the better you do your job, the worse it's going to be for you. And this is precisely, this is not fanciful, this is precisely what has come to be. This is what has kind of brought us to this crisis of accommodation in many cities in the world. And it affects the people who design the products that produce, or in part produce the crisis themselves. So you're looking at alienation, and I think this argues for a class critique of architecture. So that's more or less where I want to end this, but I certainly don't want to kind of claim that I myself am uniquely practicing this as a kind of further and concluding element of this presentation. I'd just like to acknowledge the work that's being done, not within academia, but by architectural critics, some of which is explicitly, though not exclusively, class critical. So I want to effectively give a shout out to people like Marissa Courtwright, and essays like Death to the Calling, A Job in Architecture is Still a Job, to Marinella Deprile here, calling out the theorizing, the kind of theorizing that goes on in academia and how irrelevant it is to addressing some of the social conditions that architecture contributes to negatively. Or Zach Mortis talking about interrogating inequality in the built environment. Anjali Rao talking about the prospects and the promises of unionization. Or Kate Wagner here writing recently, explicitly taking architects to task, such as Tom Main of Morphosis, for their involvement in the Line project in Saudi Arabia by NEOM. So I don't want to categorize them as only being interested in class criticism. They might produce other work as well, but we can certainly see that there is a current of class critical criticism in architectural journalism today, and at the moment I feel this is much more important than whatever theorizing goes on in academia, because it is working towards a kind of, at least the possibility of a popular literacy of the built environment and how architecture is implicated in the reproduction of many of the injustices, environmental, social, racial, that we find there today. So thanks for listening. Comments, as long as they're not too rude, very welcome. Thank you.